This Spark presenter's mission is to improve treatment, impact quality of life, and the long-term outlook for those affected by Duchenne muscular dystrophy through research, advocacy, education, and compassion. Please welcome CEO, patient educator, and dedicated mother who is changing how the industry views rare disease, Pat Furlong.
Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me here. I was asked to speak about inspiration, but actually, I'm not going to speak to you about inspiration. I'm going to speak to you about impact. And I'm going to tell you my story. That's a little bit odd, and it wasn't my choice. I was recruited here. I was recruited to this because the stars aligned much differently. You see, I had Plan A, and Plan A, we're going to have a slide, Plan A was about Woodstock. Yes, so I was at Woodstock, and I have to say with my family, my daughters, the cool factor and my sons went up 100% when they saw that I was at Woodstock. I don't know if you can see me in the crowd, but I told them how much I enjoyed it. What I didn't tell them that I was from Ohio, I was in college, and my mouth was just hung to the floor when I said, look at what he's doing and look at what she's doing. Oh my God. But that said, I was very cool and when I explained the story to them. My idea from Plan A was that I was going to be recruited to one of the bands, right? So after Woodstock, I landed in New York City, and I was sitting outside of a bar because, you know, in Glamour magazine, they had those shots with the eyes covered, and then people would find them, and then they would make them into movie stars or into, in my case, I was going to be part of this wonderful environment and certainly maybe Janis Joplin's band. That was my ideal. So my father, who's German, arrived in New York City and said, well, may not be your best choice. You can't play a musical instrument, you can't sing, you clear a room, and you can't dance. So what is it that you're going to do? So I went back to college and thought about Plan B. So my Plan B was this. My Plan B was a family. My Plan B was a bachelor's in nursing and a master's in nursing from Ohio State University, and then at Ohio State, I ran the medical and surgical intensive care unit, whole organ transplantation. I married Tom Furlong, a family physician, and we together were in Akron while he did his residency, and then there in Akron, Ohio, I ran the dialysis unit. I took care of adults because that's who got sick. I think during my career and my education, I might have slept through all the pediatrics because I didn't want kids to get sick. I didn't like it, and I didn't think they should be sick. And I thought those adults, you know, they did something so I could manage all that. So in 1984, everyone in that family, to include my husband, was potty trained. So I had an agreement with my husband that when that happened, I would take the MedCat and I would go to medical school. And that was the best plan ever, right? I even passed the MedCat. Except that on a June day in 1984, those two little boys, Patrick and Christopher, were diagnosed with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Now, I don't know how much you know about Duchenne. Duchenne is a X-linked genetic disease. So 1 in 5,000, 4,600 boys will have Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and 1 in 4,600 women will be unknown carriers of Duchenne muscular dystrophy. I have no family history, so I went down to a hospital to get a final diagnosis on the boys, and the doctor said to me, those two boys have Duchenne muscular dystrophy. They're going to follow a very consistent, predictable prognosis. They're walking now. They'll lose the ability to walk by the time they're 8 or 9. They won't lift their arms to their face to feed themselves by the time they're 12, and they'll be dead in their teens. He said, there's no hope and no help. There's nothing to do. You need to go home. And then he continued the conversation. One would think you'd stop right there, right, and put your arms around somebody. But he continued it, and he said to me, and what else is going to happen is those two girls are going to hate you because of the amount of care you give the boys. And your husband will leave you because 96% of the marriages of rare, progressive pediatric illnesses result in divorce. Then he said, you want to go to lunch? He was a colleague of my husband's. I grabbed him by the tie, put him up to my nose and said, no, you shouldn't be in medicine. You should get out. So what happens then? What can you do, right? What can you do? You're faced with nothing. It was 1984. Al Gore didn't give us the internet. We didn't have it, right? So if I was going to find anything, it's door to door. So I went home that day, and I went to the bank and borrowed $100,000. So my husband was seeing patients. He came home and said, "What did you do today?" I said, "Well, I put it in the bank under my name." And he said, so I said, "I borrowed $100,000. He said, "We're borrowing to live, we're borrowing on a house, we're borrowing on a practice, and let me get it right. You have $100,000. So I said, yes. That didn't turn out to be a great dinner. For a couple years after that, it didn't turn out to be a great conversation. I went down to University of Cincinnati School of Medicine. I ordered in, remember, no internet, all of the publications related to Duchenne muscular dystrophy. I circled the PIs. I circled the clinicians. I made appointments at the labs of those clinicians and those academics, and I went there and I said, "I'm looking for a job as a postdoc." I wasn't. But I wanted to know a couple things. I didn't want them to pat me on the head. I've already heard no hope and no help. I wanted to know, what do you know? What do you know about this? How well is it characterized? What don't you know? How much money is here? Who's investing? Is industry here? Who's here? Who's here? I went to the clinicians and said, what medical tools do you apply to these children? What can we do now? What can we do now to buy 5 minutes? I'd like 5 minutes more than I have. So I learned the disease was somewhat characterized. We had a gene and a protein product. We had not much else. There was no money here, none. NIH wasn't investing, industry wasn't here. There were no standards of care. So there were no medical tools being applied. They were basically watching these kids decline and then burying them, which was what I faced. So that wasn't very good. So once I was found out, as you might imagine, in my travels, I was found out that I am not a postdoc, and in fact, I'm not a doctor. So then I was the crazy Mrs. Furlong, which was fine for me. And so I decided to have a meeting and bring all these people together, and they said, we're not coming. We're just not coming. So I was in an office of Dr. Lee Sweeney, who was chair of physiology at the University of Pennsylvania, and on his desk was Time magazine. And it was Time magazine that had French Anderson and Francis Collins on the front for doing the first gene therapy experiment. I said, oh, they're coming. Those folks are coming. He said, no, they're not. I said, no, they've accepted. So, so we scheduled the meeting. I flew out to Pasadena and talked to French Anderson, flew to the NIH and spoke to Francis Collins, and I said, I just lied that you're coming to a meeting, you have to come. They came. They came. I started a foundation called Project Muscular Dystrophy. I said we're going to begin to invest in research. So during this meeting that turned out to be a big argument with Francis Collins and French Anderson about, they said we can cure this. All the academics, 30 of them, said we can't, this is what we don't know, we don't have money, we don't have standards of care. And I took that down as a business plan. So money, a plan, standards of care. So then I went to Washington, and because I didn't know, I was writing to various representatives like, help me do this, and other parents were doing that as well, but it wasn't getting through. So I thought there must be a system that I'm really unaware of. So I went to Washington and hired, better known as our professional consultants, and to all of this audience, lobbyists. So I hired a group of lobbyists. We went office to office in Washington, D.C. on both the House and the Senate side. I made a few friends. One of them was the late Senator Wellstone. Another was Senator, then House member Roger Wicker. So we made friends. And so we decided that there would be a hearing about Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And Senator Wicker, or then House member Wicker, said to me, well, what would you think a bill would say? And I said, standards of care, a research plan, and centers of excellence. So that became the MD Care Act. It was introduced during the hearing in 2001 as the MD Care Act. It was passed in 2001, even in spite of the 9/11 tragedy, when I thought not only was that a tragedy for our whole country, but a tragedy for a bill that I thought was really important. House member Roger Wicker pulled it off the shelf, got it passed, and if you don't like George Bush, he did one thing right, and that is signed that law. So from there till now, we have a bill that translated into $500 million in research for the muscular dystrophies, 300 of which is Duchenne. In addition to that, galvanizing the field, we now today have 28 companies looking at this disease that is now well characterized, has standards of care, and a plan. So Duchenne is now the model. And so in looking at that, I thought, well, what's FDA going to say about this? And don't we need a standard language that we all talk from? So I went to the NIH with a group of parents, or the FDA with a group of parents, and I said, we want you to know what it feels like to live with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. We want you to know this because you're going to be faced approving a drug on data, but you have to know what the meaningful benefit is. What will change in these lives if a boy can walk further, if he can breathe better, if his heart works better? So we started there, and we talked about benefit risk, and I said, you're going to need to know because every decision we make in life is about benefit and risk. And they said, well, we work in data. So we did the first ever benefit risk study, caregiver preference study, and then turned around and did a patient preference study and handed it to the FDA and said, is this what you wanted? Here it is. We then said to the FDA, well, I think you should write guidance so that these 28 companies have a roadmap. And they said, no, we're not going to write guidance. We're not. So they said, you do it. We wrote guidance. In 6 months, we had draft guidance working with the HIV community who are real activists. And we delivered the first ever draft guidance by a patient organization to the FDA. They then, within 11 months, turned around, used ours as a platform, and delivered us guidance. So we stand at the forefront of treatments for Duchenne. My own sons died at 15 and 17, 7 months to the day apart. And I still, to this very day, rely on what my mother said at the beginning and at the end of her life. Love many, trust few, and paddle your own canoe. I think it's not about inspiration. It's about impact. It's about filling gaps, looking at life, and saying, here's where I was recruited, and here's where I make change. It's about understanding not your bucket list, not the desires of your life. What have you been given? And what are you going to do about it? And then do it. Thank you.